The gentle autumn breeze swept through the suburban neighborhood as David Chen pulled into his driveway, exhausted from another long day at the construction site. His mother-in-law had been watching his 11-month-old daughter, Lily, while his wife Amy worked the afternoon shift at the local hospital. It was their usual routine, one that had worked perfectly for the past few months, until today. As David walked up to the front door, he could hear Lily's cries through the open window. Not her usual fussy cries that came with teething or tiredness, but something different, something that made his heart race. These were screams of pure terror, unlike anything he'd ever heard from his normally cheerful baby girl. He fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly as he rushed to unlock the door. The moment he stepped inside, the screaming intensified. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Wu, stood in the living room, looking completely bewildered as she tried to comfort the hysterical child. "I don't know what happened," Mrs. Wu explained, her voice shaking. "She was fine all day, playing with her toys, taking her nap. But when I picked her up from her playpen about 20 minutes ago, she just started screaming. I've tried everything, her bottle, her favorite stuffed elephant, singing to her, nothing works." David reached for Lily, expecting her to calm down in her father's familiar embrace. Instead, something unprecedented happened. As soon as Mrs. Wu tried to hand Lily to him, the baby's eyes went wide with terror. She thrashed violently, pushing away from both adults with such force that Mrs. Wu almost lost her grip. The child's face had turned bright red from crying, and her tiny body was trembling. But what truly chilled David to his core was the way Lily looked at her grandmother, with pure, unmasked fear. His daughter, who had always adored her grandmother, who would giggle and reach for Mrs. Wu every time she came over, was now treating her as if she were a complete stranger. David's police officer training kicked in, and he began to notice other concerning details. Lily's breathing was irregular, coming in short, panicked gasps. Her pupils were dilated, and she was sweating despite the comfortable temperature in the house. Something was very, very wrong. "How long has she been acting like this?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he pulled out his phone. "About 20 minutes, Mrs. Wu repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, I swear I didn't do anything. She just changed. Like a switch had been flipped." David nodded, already dialing 911. As a former first responder, he knew better than to ignore his instincts when they were screaming at him that something wasn't right. The dispatcher answered promptly, and David reported the situation, making sure to emphasize the sudden onset and severity of Lily's symptoms. While waiting for the ambulance, David attempted to piece together the day's events. Mrs. Wu described a normal morning: breakfast at 8 a.m., playtime in the living room, a short walk in the backyard where Lily had watched the butterflies on their new flower bush, lunch at noon, followed by her afternoon nap. Did she eat anything unusual? Any new foods? David questioned, watching as Lily continued to sob, though her screams had diminished to whimpers. Mrs. Wu shook her head. Only her usual baby food and the banana I mashed for her snack. Everything from the same brands we always use. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief. David had already texted Amy, knowing she would leave work immediately. As the paramedics pulled up to the house, Lily's behavior suddenly shifted again. She became completely silent, her little body going rigid in Mrs. Wu's arms. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The paramedics entered, their presence filling the modest living room. They asked quick, efficient questions while examining Lily, who had begun to show new symptoms. Her eyes were tracking movement sluggishly, and her skin had taken on a slightly grayish tinge. "We need to get her to the hospital right away," the lead paramedic announced, her tone professional but urgent. "Her vital signs are concerning, and these behavior changes could indicate several serious conditions." As they prepared to transport Lily, David noticed something odd. On the coffee table sat Lily's favorite sippy cup, the one with little ducks painted on it. Next to it was Mrs. Wu's teacup, still half full with her afternoon green tea. Something about the arrangement nagged at him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him. David rode in the ambulance with Lily, holding her tiny hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. His mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. What could have caused such a dramatic change in his happy, healthy baby? The paramedics had already ruled out common explanations like fever or typical childhood illnesses. As they rushed toward the hospital, David couldn't shake the image of Lily's face when she looked at her grandmother. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition of something wrong, something that her infant mind couldn't comprehend but instinctively knew to be dangerous. Her reaction went beyond simple stranger anxiety or typical baby fussiness. The ambulance sped through the early evening traffic, its sirens parting the sea of cars like a hot knife through butter. Inside, the paramedics worked efficiently, monitoring Lily's vital signs and recording every change in her condition. David watched, feeling helpless as his daughter's life hung in the balance, knowing that somewhere in the events of this ordinary day lay the key to understanding what had gone so terribly wrong. The emergency room burst into activity as the ambulance arrived. Amy was already there, still in her nurse's scrubs, her face pale with worry as she rushed to meet them. The moment she saw Lily's condition, her professional composure cracked, tears welling up in her eyes. "What happened to our baby?" she whispered, reaching for David's hand as the medical team transferred Lily to an examination room. The pediatric emergency specialist, Dr. Patel, began her assessment immediately, her experienced hands gentle but thorough as she examined the now lethargic infant. "Has Lily been exposed to any medications? Any household chemicals?" Dr. Patel asked, her keen eyes noting every detail of the baby's condition. Both parents shook their heads, but David suddenly remembered something. "The tea," he said, his voice hoarse. Mom's teacup was on the coffee table next to Lily's sippy cup. Could she have somehow? Amy's eyes widened with understanding. "Mom always drinks special herbal teas from her garden. She's been into traditional remedies since." Her voice trailed off as she grabbed her phone, quickly dialing her mother's number. Mrs. Wu answered on the first ring, her voice thick with tears. "Amy, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I've been going over everything in my mind. Mom, the tea you were drinking today, what was in it?" Amy put the phone on speaker so Dr. Patel could hear the response. There was a pause, then Mrs. Wu's voice came through, shaking slightly. "Just my usual afternoon blend, green tea with some herbs from my garden. Some chamomile, mint, and..." She hesitated. "I tried a new flower that bloomed in the back corner of the garden. It looked like morning glory, but with darker leaves. I only used a few petals because it smelled so sweet." Dr. Patel's expression changed instantly. "Mrs. Wu, can you take a photo of this plant and send it right away? Also, is there any of the tea left?" "Yes, both the plant and the tea are here. I'll send photos right now." The next few minutes were tense as they waited. Lily had been connected to monitors, and for delivering fluids to her tiny body. Her vital signs had stabilized somewhat, but she remained unusually quiet, her normally bright eyes unfocused and distant. When the photos arrived, Dr. Patel's suspicions were confirmed. "That's not morning glory," she said, showing the image to her colleagues. "It's Datura stramonium, devil's trumpet. It's highly toxic, especially to children. Even a small amount can cause severe symptoms." "But how did Lily get exposed?" David asked, his police training once again kicking in. "She couldn't have reached the teacup." A young nurse who had been checking Lily's vital signs spoke up. "The sippy cup, could it have been refilled with the wrong cup?" They were next to each other on the table. The pieces started falling into place. Mrs. Wu's next text confirmed their fears. "I remember now. I was on the phone with my sister, distracted. I might have, oh no. I might have absent-mindedly poured some tea into her cup when I was refilling mine. Amy sank into a chair, her medical training allowing her to fully understand the implications. Datura poisoning explained everything: Lily's terror, her physical symptoms, the sudden onset. The plant was known to cause intense fear, hallucinations, and a racing heart, among other symptoms. The next hours were a blur of activity. The toxicology team was consulted, treatment protocols were initiated, and Lily was transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit for close monitoring. David and Amy took turns sitting with her, watching as the medications slowly began to take effect. Mrs. Wu arrived at the hospital, her face streaked with tears, carrying the remaining tea as evidence. The guilt and anguish in her eyes were painful to witness. She stood in the doorway of Lily's room, afraid to come closer, remembering her granddaughter's terrified reaction. "Mom, come in," Amy said softly. "It was an accident. We know you'd never hurt Lily intentionally." But Mrs. Wu shook her head, her hands trembling as she handed over the tea container to a nurse for analysis. "I should have been more careful. My mother always warned me about checking plants 3 times before using them in tea. I got careless, comfortable. I nearly killed my own granddaughter." David, who had been quietly watching the monitors, spoke up. "The important thing is that we caught it in time. My police instincts and your honest answers helped the doctors identify the problem quickly. Now we focus on Lily getting better." As if on cue, Lily stirred in her hospital crib. Her eyes opened, clearer now as the toxin began to leave her system. The terror that had filled them earlier was gone, replaced by confusion and fatigue. When she saw her grandmother, she reached out one tiny hand, gurgling softly. Mrs. Wu broke down at this simple gesture of forgiveness. Amy guided her mother to the crib, where Lily grasped her grandmother's finger with surprising strength. The simple action spoke volumes. Even after everything, the bond between them remained unbroken. Dr. Patel returned with updated blood test results, her expression more relaxed than before. "The treatment is working. The toxin levels are dropping, and her vital signs are stabilizing. We'll keep her for observation for at least 24 hours, but I'm optimistic about her recovery." As night fell over the hospital, the family settled into an uneasy vigil. The incident had shaken them all deeply, highlighting how quickly an ordinary day could turn into a nightmare. Mrs. Wu had already decided to tear out her entire garden, unwilling to risk another accident, but Amy convinced her to wait. "Instead, we'll learn from this," Amy suggested. "We can work with a botanist to identify every plant. Maybe even create a garden safety guide for other families. Turn this scary experience into something positive." Outside Lily's room, nurses and doctors continued their rounds, the hospital's rhythm unchanged by the small drama that had unfolded within its walls. But for the Chen family, everything had shifted. They had glimpsed how fragile life could be, how a simple mistake could have devastating consequences. The morning sun crept through the hospital window, casting a warm glow over Lily's crib. She had slept peacefully through the night, her vital signs growing stronger with each passing hour. David sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, having insisted on taking the night shift while Amy went home to rest and comfort Mrs. Wu. A soft knock on the door drew his attention. Dr. Patel entered, accompanied by a tall woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Dr. Rivera from the Poison Control Center. "We've completed the analysis of the tea sample," Dr. Rivera explained, pulling up a chair. "The concentration of datura was significant, but what's truly concerning is that we've seen 3 similar cases in the past month across different neighborhoods." David's police instincts immediately sharpened. 3 cases? All from the same plant? Dr. Rivera nodded, opening a folder containing photographs. All involving what people thought were ornamental morning glories. "We've traced it back to a new supplier at several local garden centers. They apparently mislabeled a batch of plants. This information hit David like a physical blow. His daughter's terrifying experience wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger problem that could affect other families. He thought of all the home gardens in their neighborhood, how many people might have bought plants from the same supplier. "I need to make some calls," he said, reaching for his phone. His former colleagues at the police department needed to know about this. It wasn't just about Lily anymore, it was about preventing other children from going through the same ordeal. As David stepped into the hallway to make his calls, Amy arrived with fresh clothes and a determined look in her eyes. She had spent the night researching, printing out information about toxic plants and garden safety. Her nursing background, combined with this personal experience, had sparked something in her. "I've been thinking," she said as she checked Lily's monitors. "We need to do more than just warn people. We need to educate them. Most people don't realize how dangerous some common plants can be." Dr. Rivera's eyes lit up. "Actually, we've been trying to develop a community education program about plant safety, but it's been difficult to get people interested. Your story, a real family's experience, could make all the difference." While they discussed possibilities, Lily began to stir. Her eyes opened, clear and bright, focusing immediately on her mother's face. The fear and confusion from yesterday were gone, replaced by her usual cheerful expression. When she smiled, everyone in the room felt the weight of worry lift slightly from their shoulders. Mrs. Wu arrived shortly after, carrying a thick notebook filled with pressed plant samples and careful notes. She had spent the sleepless night documenting every plant in her garden, determined to turn her mistake into a learning opportunity. Her hand still trembled slightly as she held Lily, but the baby showed no sign of yesterday's terror, happily playing with her grandmother's necklace. "I've contacted the garden center where I bought the plants," Mrs. Wu said, her voice stronger than yesterday. "They were horrified when I told them what happened. The manager is already pulling all the suspicious plants from their shelves." David returned from making his calls, his expression serious but hopeful. "The department is taking this seriously. They're launching an investigation into the supplier, and they want our help with a public awareness campaign." As they talked, a plan began to take shape. Amy would work with the hospital to develop educational materials about plant safety. Mrs. Wu would share her experience at garden clubs and community centers, teaching others about the importance of proper plant identification. David would coordinate with law enforcement to track down the source of the mislabeled plants and prevent future incidents. Dr. Patel watched all this with approval as she completed Lily's morning examination. "Her recovery is remarkable," she announced. "If her blood work comes back clear this afternoon, you can take her home tomorrow." The news brought tears of relief to everyone's eyes. Mrs. Wu hugged her daughter, whispering apologies that Amy gently shushed away. "Mom, you've already turned this accident into something positive," Amy said. "Look at all the good that's going to come from it." Later that afternoon, as Lily napped peacefully, a local news reporter visited the hospital. The story of the baby's terrifying reaction to a common garden plant had caught their attention, especially given the other cases. David and Amy agreed to share their experience, hoping to warn other families about the potential dangers lurking in their gardens. The reporter was particularly moved by Mrs. Wu's transformation from a guilt-ridden grandmother to a passionate advocate for garden safety. "Sometimes it takes a close call to wake us up to the dangers around us," Mrs. Wu told her, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "If sharing our story prevents even one other family from going through this, then something good will have come from my mistake." As the day progressed, more people became involved in their cause. The hospital's pediatric department offered to host monthly seminars on household safety, with a special focus on plant toxicity. Local garden clubs reached out, eager to participate in the awareness campaign. Even the garden center manager arrived with boxes of proper plant identification guides to distribute to customers. Through it all, Lily remained blissfully unaware of the movement she had inspired. She played with her toys, took her naps, and brought smiles to everyone who entered her room. Her rapid recovery seemed almost miraculous, though Dr. Patel explained it was thanks to the quick recognition of symptoms and immediate medical intervention. "Your family's response to this crisis has been extraordinary," Dr. Rivera commented as she prepared to leave. "Most people would have kept quiet out of shame or embarrassment, but you've chosen to use your experience to help others. That's remarkable." As evening approached, the activity around Lily's room finally quieted. The family sat together, watching the sunset through the hospital window. Mrs. Wu had brought a new tea set, this one carefully labeled with each ingredient source and safety information. They shared a pot of certified chamomile tea, celebrating Lily's recovery and their new purpose. It's strange, David reflected, watching his daughter sleep peacefully. Yesterday morning, I was just focused on getting through another ordinary day. Now we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Amy squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. Their family had been through a terrifying ordeal, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and with a clear mission to help others avoid similar dangers. The day of Lily's discharge from the hospital arrived with unexpected fanfare. Word had spread through social media about the mislabeled toxic plants, and concerned parents were flooding the hospital's switchboard with calls. Local news vans parked outside the hospital entrance, their reporters eager to cover what had become a significant public safety story. Dr. Patel completed Lily's final examination with a satisfied smile. "Her blood work is completely clear," she announced, tickling Lily's tummy and earning a happy giggle. "She's back to her normal self, but this little one has started quite a movement." As Amy packed up their belongings, David noticed his phone buzzing continuously. His former police colleagues had been busy investigating the plant supplier, and the results were disturbing. The supplier, Green Thumb Wholesalers, had apparently cut corners by importing unlabeled plant seedlings from an overseas source. "We've tracked down similar incidents in 3 other states," Detective Rodriguez, David's former partner, explained over the phone. "It's not just Datura. There are reports of other misidentified toxic plants being sold as common garden varieties. We're looking at a major case of negligence." Mrs. Wu, who had arrived early to help with the discharge process, listened to the conversation with growing concern. She pulled out her notebook, now filled with detailed sketches and safety notes from her research over the past few days. "I've been documenting everything I can find about toxic look-alike plants," she said, her voice firm with purpose. "There are so many that could be mistaken for common garden plants." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. A woman in a professional suit entered, introducing herself as Ms. Thompson from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. "We've been following your case closely," she explained. "The implications for public safety are significant. We'd like your help in developing new guidelines for plant suppliers and garden centers." Amy and David exchanged glances. Their personal nightmare was evolving into something much larger, a chance to prevent similar incidents across the country. As they discussed possibilities with Ms. Thompson, Lily played contentedly in her mother's arms, unaware of her role in sparking this chain of events. The hospital's administrative director joined them, bringing unexpected news. "We've received calls from several pediatric centers across the state," she shared. "They want to implement the plant safety awareness program you've helped develop. Your experience has opened many eyes to this hidden danger." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Mrs. Wu revealed her own news. The local community college had invited her to teach a workshop on garden safety and plant identification. Her years of gardening experience, combined with her recent intensive research and personal experience, made her uniquely qualified to educate others. "I never imagined my mistake would lead to this," Mrs. Wu said softly, helping Amy pack Lily's things. "But sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned from their errors." The journey home was surreal. News crews followed at a respectful distance, while social media buzzed with shares of their story and the emerging investigation into Green Thumb Wholesalers. David's phone kept lighting up with messages from law enforcement agencies in other states, all reporting similar cases. Arriving home, they found their front yard filled with supportive neighbors. Someone had planted a new garden bed with carefully labeled, "Safe Plants." A banner reading, "Welcome Home, Lily," stretched across the porch, and several local garden club members stood ready with information packets about plant safety. Inside, the house had been thoroughly cleaned and baby-proofed anew. Mrs. Wu's sister had organized a team of volunteers to verify every plant in and around the house, creating a detailed safety map for the family. The kitchen counter held dishes of home-cooked meals from neighbors, each container carefully labeled with ingredients. As they settled in, Amy received an email from the hospital administration. They wanted her to lead a new parent education program, combining her nursing expertise with their recent experience. The program would focus not just on plant safety, but on overall household hazard awareness. It's amazing how one incident can create such positive change, Amy mused, watching Lily explore her familiar surroundings with renewed energy. But I keep thinking about all the other families who might not know about these dangers. David nodded, still scrolling through messages about the investigation. The supplier's negligence put countless people at risk. But because of what happened to Lily, they're being held accountable, and new safety measures are being put in place. Mrs. Wu, who had been quietly arranging her teaching materials at the dining room table, spoke up. "I've been thinking about creating a guide, something simple but comprehensive. Pictures of safe and unsafe plants side by side, tips for identification, emergency procedures. Something every family could keep handy." The idea resonated with everyone. Ms. Thompson, who had followed up with a phone call, immediately offered support from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. They could help distribute the guide nationally, potentially reaching millions of households. As evening approached, the family settled into their familiar routine, though everything felt different now. The ordinary act of preparing Lily's bedtime bottle carried new weight, every step checked and double-checked. Mrs. Wu prepared a safe, certified chamomile tea for the adults, her movements deliberate and focused. Lily, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep quickly in her crib. Her parents and grandmother sat in the living room, surrounded by papers, plant guides, and the beginnings of their new mission. The weight of responsibility they felt was balanced by the hope of preventing other families from experiencing similar scares. "Tomorrow, we start the real work," David said, reviewing the investigation updates. The supplier's records show distribution to garden centers in 12 states. "We need to track down every potentially dangerous plant." Amy added her own plans. "The hospital wants to start the education program next week. We'll begin with expecting parents, then expand to community groups." "Mom, would you be willing to share your story?" Mrs. Wu nodded, her earlier shame now transformed into determination. "Every parent, every grandparent, needs to know these risks. We can't change what happened, but we can change what happens next." A week after Lily's return home, the impact of their experience continued to grow. The Chen family's dining room had transformed into an impromptu command center, with maps tracking the distribution of potentially dangerous plants, stacks of educational materials, and Mrs. Wu's ever-expanding collection of plant identification guides. The morning began with an unexpected video call from a mother in Oregon. Her 2-year-old son had experienced similar symptoms after exposure to what they thought was a harmless garden plant. Thanks to the viral spread of Lily's story, they had recognized the signs immediately and sought medical attention. "Your family saved my boy," the mother said, wiping tears from her eyes as she held her recovered toddler. "If I hadn't seen your story on the news, I might have just thought he was having a tantrum. I wouldn't have known to get help so quickly." David added another pin to their incident map while Amy took detailed notes. Each new case strengthened their resolve and provided valuable data for the ongoing investigation. The pattern was becoming clearer: garden centers in multiple states had unknowingly sold mislabeled toxic plants to unsuspecting customers. Mrs. Wu's first community college workshop had filled up within hours of being announced. She spent her mornings preparing teaching materials, pressing plant samples between glass plates for easy identification, and creating detailed comparison charts. Her transformation from guilt-ridden grandmother to passionate educator was remarkable to witness. "I never thought my mistake would lead to this," she reflected, carefully labeling a specimen of harmless morning glory alongside its dangerous look-alike. But sometimes life's hardest lessons become our most important teachings. The hospital's new parent education program was also gaining momentum. Amy's first session had drawn such a large crowd that they had to move it to the hospital auditorium. Parents, grandparents, and caregivers sat captivated as she shared their story, combining personal experience with professional medical knowledge. "The scariest part wasn't just the immediate danger," Amy explained to her audience. "It was realizing how easily this could happen to any family. That's why we're here, to make sure it doesn't." Detective Rodriguez called with updates on the investigation. Green Thumb Wholesalers' records had revealed a troubling pattern of cutting corners to reduce costs. The company had switched to an unauthorized overseas supplier that provided unlabeled seedlings at a fraction of the usual price. "We've traced shipments to over 200 garden centers across the country," he reported. "The good news is, most of these plants haven't been sold yet. The consumer safety alert you helped create has led to widespread removal of suspicious stock." Lily, now fully recovered, played happily in her safety-verified playpen, surrounded by toys sent by well-wishers from around the country. Her cheerful babbling provided a constant reminder of why their work was so important. Each time she smiled or reached for her grandmother without fear, they saw proof that healing was possible. The local garden center had become an unexpected ally in their campaign. The manager, still shaken by his unwitting role in the incident, had implemented a rigorous plant verification system. Every potentially dangerous plant now carried prominent warning labels, and staff underwent mandatory safety training. "We're completely overhauling our supplier verification process," he explained during a visit to their home. "Your family's experience opened our eyes to gaps in the system we never even considered." Mrs. Wu's garden safety guide was taking shape, combining her traditional knowledge with modern safety protocols. She worked with a botanical illustrator to create clear, detailed drawings of common toxic plants and their safe look-alikes. The guide would be published in multiple languages, making it accessible to more communities. One afternoon, as Amy prepared for another hospital presentation, she received an unexpected call from the Center for Disease Control. They wanted to include her family's case study in a new national database of household hazards, using it to improve emergency response protocols across the country. "Your documentation of Lily's symptoms and the quick response time has provided valuable data," the CDC representative explained. "It's helping us create better guidelines for identifying and treating plant-based poisoning in children." The support from their community continued to grow. Local gardening clubs organized volunteer teams to help homeowners identify potentially dangerous plants. Schools began incorporating basic plant safety into their science curricula, using materials developed from Mrs. Wu's workshop. David's former police department had expanded their investigation, working with consumer protection agencies to track down other potential cases of negligent plant suppliers. Their work was creating ripples through the industry, prompting calls for stricter regulation and better verification processes. "We're seeing suppliers voluntarily implementing new safety protocols," Detective Rodriguez shared during his latest update. "Nobody wants to be the next Green Thumb Wholesalers. Your family's story has become a wake-up call for the entire industry." As evening approached, the family gathered in their newly safety-proofed backyard. Mrs. Wu had replanted her garden with carefully verified, safe species, creating a living classroom for her workshops. Each plant bore a clear label with both common and scientific names, making it a model of garden safety. Lily crawled happily through the grass, exploring under her parents' watchful eyes. The terror of that day in the hospital seemed distant now, transformed into a powerful force for positive change. Yet none of them would ever forget the lesson they had learned about the hidden dangers in seemingly innocent places. "Sometimes I think about all the other families we'll never meet," Amy said, watching Lily play with a safe, rubber plant toy. "The ones who won't have to go through what we did because of the changes being made now." Mrs. Wu nodded, adding the finishing touches to her latest plant identification chart. "That's how we heal, by preventing others from experiencing the same pain. Every family we help, every garden we make safer, is part of Lily's legacy." 1 month after Lily's incident, the Chen family received an invitation that would take their advocacy to a new level. The National Garden Safety Council was holding its annual conference, and they wanted the family to be keynote speakers. The event would bring together garden center owners, plant suppliers, and safety experts from across the country. "They want us to share our story," Amy explained during dinner, while Lily happily mashed sweet potatoes on her high chair tray. "But more than that, they want to use our experience to create new national safety standards for plant suppliers and garden centers." Mrs. Wu looked up from her latest batch of educational materials, her eyes bright with purpose. Her workshop series had become so popular that other community colleges were requesting her curriculum. "We could reach so many more people," she said softly. "Help prevent so many potential accidents." David had his own news to share. The investigation into Green Thumb wholesalers had uncovered a network of unauthorized plant suppliers operating across multiple countries. His experience as a police officer, combined with their family's story, had made him a valuable consultant in the ongoing investigation. "The company's owner has agreed to cooperate," he revealed. "He's providing information about other suppliers who might be cutting corners. This could help shut down the entire network of unsafe plant distribution." As they discussed these developments, a local news crew arrived for a scheduled follow-up story. The reporter, who had covered their initial hospital experience, was amazed by how their family's crisis had evolved into a national movement for garden safety. "When I first reported your story," she commented, watching Lily play safely in her verified plant-free area, "I thought it was about one family's close call. I never imagined it would expose such widespread safety issues in the gardening industry." The camera rolled as Mrs. Wu demonstrated her plant identification techniques, now refined through weeks of teaching and research. She had developed a simple but effective system using color coding and visual markers to help people quickly identify potentially dangerous plants. "See these leaf patterns," she explained, holding up 2 similar-looking plants. "A safe morning glory has these distinct characteristics, while datura shows these subtle but crucial differences. It's about training your eye to notice these details before adding any new plant to your garden." Amy's hospital education program had expanded to include virtual sessions, reaching parents and caregivers across the country. Her medical background, combined with their personal experience, made her presentations particularly impactful. She had a way of explaining complex botanical toxicology in terms anyone could understand. "The most dangerous assumption," she told her online audience, "is thinking that all garden plants are safe. Nature is beautiful, but it demands respect and knowledge. One mistake, one moment of confusion, can change everything." The family's dining room command center had evolved into a sophisticated operation. Maps tracking incidents and supplier networks covered one wall, while another displayed Mrs. Wu's comprehensive plant identification charts. The table held laptops connected to various safety organizations and law enforcement agencies. Late that evening, after the news crew left, they received an unexpected call from an emergency room in Florida. A grandmother there had recognized the symptoms of datura poisoning in her grandchild thanks to their widely shared story. The child was already receiving treatment, the diagnosis confirmed far more quickly than Lily's had been. "That's the 5th case this month where early recognition led to faster treatment," Amy noted, adding the incident to their database. Each case strengthened their resolve and provided valuable data for improving response protocols. Mrs. Wu's garden had become a model of safety and education. Local schools now brought students for field trips, learning about plant safety through hands-on experience. She had created clear pathways through the garden, with plants grouped by safety levels and clearly labeled with both warnings and educational information. Children need to learn early, she explained to a group of visiting teachers. Not to fear plants, but to understand and respect them. Knowledge is their best protection. The community's response continued to grow. Neighborhood garden clubs had organized Safety Saturday events, where homeowners could bring photos or samples of their plants for identification. Local garden centers participated, offering free safety consultations and plant verification services. David's police contacts reported that the investigation's ripple effects were reaching even further than expected. Garden suppliers across the country were voluntarily submitting their plants for verification, eager to avoid association with the scandal. The industry was self-regulating in ways no one had anticipated. Sometimes positive change comes from unexpected places, he reflected, watching Lily play with her safe, plant-themed educational toys. Who would have thought our little girl's terrible experience would lead to all this? The preparations for the National Garden Safety Council conference consumed their evenings. Each family member had a unique perspective to share: Mrs. Wu's journey from casual gardener to safety educator, Amy's medical insights and parent education experience, and David's law enforcement perspective on industry regulation. Lily, now entirely recovered, had become a symbol of both the dangers of plant misidentification and the power of turning tragedy into positive change. Her photo, smiling and healthy in her grandmother's safe garden, appeared in safety materials across the country. "We need to talk about what happened at the hospital," Amy told the news reporter during a quiet moment. "Not just the medical emergency, but the moment we realized this was bigger than our family. When we understood we had a responsibility to prevent this from happening to others." Mrs. Wu added her own perspective, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "In my culture, we believe that difficulties come to teach us important lessons. But the true test is what we do with those lessons, whether we keep them to ourselves or share them to help others." The reporter was particularly moved by how the family had transformed their traumatic experience into a force for positive change. "You could have simply focused on recovery and moved on," she observed. "Instead, you've created a movement that's saving lives." As night fell, the family sat in their safety-certified garden, watching the sunset. Lily played contentedly with her toys, occasionally toddling over to hug her grandmother's legs or reach for her mother's hand. The terror of that hospital day seemed distant now, but its lessons remained vivid and vital. "We're not just telling our story anymore," David said, reviewing their conference presentation materials. "We're part of changing the way people think about garden safety, about the responsibility we all have to protect our children." The day of the National Garden Safety Council conference arrived with unexpected intensity. The convention center buzzed with activity as experts, industry leaders, and concerned citizens gathered from across the country. The Chen family's story had drawn unprecedented attention to the event, with attendance numbers breaking all previous records. Backstage, Amy adjusted Lily's tiny dress while Mrs. Wu reviewed her presentation materials one last time. The 14-month-old toddler, now fully recovered and thriving, had become the face of their garden safety campaign. Her journey from terrified victim to symbol of positive change had touched hearts nationwide. "I never imagined we'd be here," Mrs. Wu whispered, watching attendees file into the main hall through a gap in the curtain. Among them were garden center owners, botanists, medical professionals, and even lawmakers interested in strengthening plant safety regulations. David arrived from a pre-conference meeting with law enforcement representatives. The investigation into unsafe plant suppliers had expanded significantly, revealing systemic problems in the industry supply chain. "They're creating a special task force," he reported. "Our case has opened their eyes to gaps in regulation they never knew existed." As the family prepared to take the stage, Dr. Patel made a surprise appearance. She had flown in specifically for the conference, bringing with her a comprehensive medical report on Lily's case that would help establish new treatment protocols for plant-related poisonings. "Your family's experience has already changed how we handle similar cases," she explained, giving Lily a gentle hug. Emergency rooms across the country now include plant toxicity in their initial assessment protocols, especially for unexplained behavioral changes in children. The conference hall fell silent as the Chen family took their places at the podium. Images of their journey filled the massive screens behind them, from the terrifying hospital day to their current advocacy work. Mrs. Wu stepped forward first, her voice steady as she began their story. "2 months ago, I made a mistake that nearly cost my granddaughter her life," she began, holding up 2 plant samples. "These leaves look almost identical. But one is a harmless morning glory, while the other—" She paused, letting the audience absorb the gravity of her words. "The other is Datura, a highly toxic plant that found its way into my garden through a mislabeled shipment." Amy followed with the medical perspective, sharing detailed information about recognition and treatment of plant poisoning in children. Her presentation included real cases where their shared story had led to faster diagnosis and treatment. "Time is crucial in these cases," she emphasized, showing slides of common toxic plants and their safe lookalikes. "The difference between recognition and confusion can mean everything in an emergency room setting." David presented the law enforcement angle, revealing how their investigation had uncovered a broader pattern of negligence in the plant supply industry. "This isn't just about one supplier or one type of plant," he explained. "It's about a system that prioritized profit over safety, putting countless families at risk." The audience listened intently as each family member shared their perspective. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Wu demonstrated her new plant identification system, designed to be so simple that even children could understand the basic concepts. "Safety doesn't have to be complicated," she explained, showing color-coded charts and simple visual markers. "But it does have to be consistent and accessible to everyone." During the break, garden center owners lined up to speak with the family. Many had already implemented changes based on their story, but they wanted to do more. One owner from Texas shared how he had discovered potentially dangerous plants in his own inventory after hearing about Lily's case. "We've completely revamped our verification process," he said, showing photos of his redesigned garden center. "Every plant now goes through 3 levels of identification before reaching our shelves." The conference also attracted international attention. Representatives from gardening associations in several countries requested permission to translate Mrs. Wu's safety materials and implement similar programs in their regions. "Plants don't recognize borders," a botanist from Canada pointed out. "The same dangers exist everywhere, but so do the solutions you've developed." As the day progressed, new partnerships formed and initiatives took shape. The Consumer Product Safety Commission announced plans to create a standardized plant labeling system based on Mrs. Wu's identification method. Medical organizations committed to incorporating plant safety into their parent education programs. Lily, who had been remarkably patient throughout the day, suddenly pointed at one of Mrs. Wu's plant samples and said her first clear word, "Safe." The audience erupted in applause, and Mrs. Wu had to wipe tears from her eyes. Even at such a young age, her granddaughter was absorbing the lessons they were teaching others. During the afternoon session, emergency response teams from various states shared how the Chen family's case had influenced their protocols. The quick identification of symptoms, thanks to their widely shared story, had already saved lives. "Last week, we had a case almost identical to Lily's," a paramedic from Michigan reported. "Because our team had studied your case, we knew exactly what to look for and how to respond. That child is home safe now, thanks to your family's willingness to share your experience." The day concluded with an unexpected announcement. A major botanical garden network had created a fellowship in Lily's name, dedicated to researching and promoting garden safety. The program would fund education initiatives and support ongoing research into plant identification and safety measures. As the family packed up their materials that evening, they felt the weight of what they had accomplished. Their personal tragedy had transformed into a movement that was changing how people thought about garden safety. We can't prevent every accident, Amy reflected, watching Lily fall asleep in her grandmother's arms. But we can give people the knowledge they need to protect themselves and their children. Mrs. Wu nodded, gently stroking Lily's hair. Every time I teach someone to identify a dangerous plant, every time a parent learns to create a safer garden, I feel like we're turning that terrible day into something meaningful. David added the final touch to their presentation materials, a new photo of Lily playing safely in their model garden. This was never just about our family, he said. It was about all the families we'll never meet, all the children who will be safer because of what we learned and shared. 6 months after Lily's terrifying reaction to the misidentified plant, the Chen family gathered in their transformed backyard for a very special occasion. The space that had once harbored an unexpected danger had become a nationally recognized demonstration garden for plant safety education. Today, they were celebrating not just Lily's second birthday, but also the official launch of the National Plant Safety Network. Local news crews set up their equipment as families began arriving for the combined birthday party and educational event. Lily, now a curious and energetic toddler, wore a specially made t-shirt with the words "Garden Safety Champion" across the front, tottering between guests with confident steps. Mrs. Wu, now a certified botanical safety instructor, had set up interactive learning stations throughout the garden. Each station featured carefully curated plant samples, clear identification guides, and hands-on activities designed to teach both children and adults about garden safety. What happened to our family could have ended very differently, she told a group of visiting parents, while helping their children learn to identify safe plants using her now famous color-coding system. But because of quick action and medical care, we turned a nightmare into a mission to protect others. Amy, who had taken on a leadership role in the hospital's expanded plant safety program, shared their latest statistics. Over the past 6 months, reported cases of accidental plant poisoning had decreased by 40% in areas where their education program had been implemented. The most rewarding part, she explained to a visiting medical team, is hearing from emergency rooms across the country. They tell us that parents are now coming in with suspected plant exposure cases much earlier, often with photos or samples of the plants in question. That early recognition saves precious time in treatment. David's work with law enforcement had led to unprecedented changes in the plant supply industry. The task force he helped establish had already shut down 3 major suppliers of mislabeled plants and implemented new tracking systems for plant origins. We're seeing a complete transformation in how the industry operates, he reported during an impromptu press conference. Garden centers now have access to a national database of verified suppliers, and there's a new certification process for plant identification experts. The celebration took an unexpected turn when a family arrived from across the country. Their 3-year-old son had been one of the first children saved by the widespread sharing of Lily's story. The boy, healthy and active, immediately ran to play with Lily in the safe play area. "We had to come thank you in person," his mother said, hugging Mrs. Wu with tears in her eyes. "When our son showed those same terrifying symptoms, we knew what to do because we had seen your family's story. The doctors said that early recognition probably saved his life." Throughout the afternoon, more success stories emerged. Garden center owners shared how their new safety protocols had prevented potentially dangerous plants from reaching consumers. Teachers described how children in their classes now confidently used Mrs. Wu's identification system during nature walks. The Consumer Product Safety Commission representative arrived with exciting news. The standardized plant labeling system, inspired by Mrs. Wu's method, would become mandatory nationwide within the year. International gardening organizations had already begun adapting the system for use in their countries. "Your family's experience has literally changed how the world thinks about garden safety," she announced. What started as one grandmother's careful documentation of a terrible mistake has become a global standard for plant safety. Lily, though too young to understand her role in these changes, demonstrated an innate understanding of garden safety that amazed visitors. She confidently pointed to plants in her grandmother's garden, declaring them safe or no-no with toddler certainty. As the sun began to set, the family gathered for a quiet moment away from the crowds. They sat in the special memorial garden they had created, where Mrs. Wu had planted safe, beautiful flowers in recognition of all the children who had been helped by their story. "Sometimes I look at Lily," Mrs. Wu said softly, watching her granddaughter arrange toy watering cans by size, "and I still feel that moment of terror from 6 months ago. But then I see all the lives we've touched, all the families we've helped, and I understand that everything happens for a reason." Amy nodded, adding, "What amazes me is how many people were just waiting for someone to take this issue seriously. Once we shared our story, it was like opening a floodgate of concern and action." David's phone buzzed with another update from the task force. "They've just approved funding for a permanent plant safety division," he announced. "Our family's experience has literally changed how law enforcement approaches these cases." The birthday celebration concluded with a special ceremony. The mayor announced that their city would be the first to require plant safety education in all public schools, using the curriculum Mrs. Wu had developed. Other cities were already lining up to follow their example. As guests departed, each family received a safety kit containing Mrs. Wu's plant identification guide, emergency contact information, and seeds for starting their own safe garden. The kits, sponsored by a coalition of garden centers and safety organizations, would soon be available nationwide. Looking back on the past 6 months, the family could hardly believe how far they had come. From a terrifying emergency room visit to a national movement for garden safety, their journey had touched countless lives. "We didn't choose this path," Amy reflected, helping Lily blow out her birthday candles, "but we chose to make something meaningful from it. That's the legacy we're giving our daughter." Mrs. Wu, arranging the last of her educational materials, smiled at her granddaughter. "And she'll grow up knowing that even our mistakes can lead to positive change if we're brave enough to learn from them and share those lessons with others." The day ended with a quiet family moment in their safe garden. Lily, tired from the excitement, fell asleep in her father's arms as the first stars appeared in the evening sky. The garden that had once harbored hidden danger now stood as a testament to the power of turning tragedy into triumph, fear into knowledge, and a single family's experience into a movement that would protect children for generations to come. David looked at his sleeping daughter and then at the garden that had changed their lives. "You know," he said softly, "when I first called 911 that day, I thought we were just saving one child. I never imagined we were starting something that would save so many."